You should all know how excited Eretz Yisrael is now that they heard that there's going to be a Yarchei Kala. The whole Eretz Yisrael, the ganze Eretz Yisrael is besimcha. So, B'ez Hashem, our learning now is a hagdama to get us into the mode of when we come to learn B'ez Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. B'ez Hashem, we're learning the sugya of Tofar. The sugya of Tofar, Rabbi Yisai, the big koishi in the sugya of Tofar is you have one line of Gemara. In the Kimat the Ganze Shas, there's one line in the 2,712 dafim of Shas. You have one line of Hilchos Tofar, and you have very scattered Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Mem, Siv Zayin, Siv Vav, Siv Zayin, it's the whole entire Hilchos Tofar. So you imagine if you have so little Gemara and so little Shulchan Aruch. It's also Siman Shin Yud Zayin we saw in Siv Gimel where it talks about Tefir Lizman, sowing for only temporary purposes. So you imagine that there's going to be a big koishi because we're very, very we're not wealthy in the sugya of Tofar, in the sugya of sowing, the Melacha of Shabbos, one of the 39 Melachas. We're not wealthy people. We have very, very little guidance from our Rebbeim, from the Gemaras, from the how much could the Rishonim write if there's only one line in Gemara? So that's definitely compounds the Kaishi. So B'ez Hashem, let's work. B'ez Hashem, we'll try to get the shilas. And this is the reason why you have situations in Tofar. We have some poskim saying it's mamish issa deraisa. Maybe the shilah about taking a zipper lining and putting it into a coat. There's some poskim they're going to say it could be mamish and issa deraisa. And in the weather right now, Rabbi Gottesman will tell you that in Eretz Yisrael, he had to put in a zipper lining. I'm aware that in New York, you need 2 zipper linings, my understanding is. And in Chicago, it won't even help. But there are some poskim that are telling you, you need to have 2 zipper lining. You need to put your zipper lining in before Shabbos or it's an issa deraisa of Tofar. And you have other poskim that are telling you, zipper lining. There's no issa bichlal of putting an issa lining, a zipper lining in on Shabbos. How could you have such a machlekes that somebody's telling you that there's an issa deraisa and somebody telling you to mutter gomer? So that's the result of one line of Gemara and 2 Shulchan Aruch, 2 Zivim in Shulchan Aruch. So we have a big agenda over here and a lot to work with. We have to figure out today about safety pins. We have hagdaras from some of the greatest poskim that lived that will say something is bichlal not a shaila, and then we're going to have other poskim that are going to say it's an issa deraisa mamish. It's rare. The oilam over here already very big bekiyim in Hilchos Shabbos. We've been learning together for the last year, I think, Hilchos Shabbos, and you see that's rare. It's very rare that you'll have situations where something is mamish issa gomer deraisa and something is mamish. Some poskim are saying it's mutter gomer and there's not even a shaila. It's a very rare thing. So the reason is because we're very, very poor. So we have to become wealthy today, B'ez Hashem. And we have to learn the sugya well in order to become wealthy people so that we can have the wealth of information in order to don the shilas of Tofar and to know what's taka the emes, amaisa asher yasim. So the Gemara says in Shabbos, Daf Ayin Daled and Beis, HaTofar shtei tfiris. So the Gemara says that if you sew 2 stitches, which for the sake of understanding is you take the thread, that's 1, 2. Not when you have 2 parts like this, and you have 2 begadim like this, and you take a thread and go straight through from this side into the other paper or into the other beged. That's not Tofar shtei tfiris. Shtei tfiris means you have to go up and you have to come down. So if you go up and then you come down, that's called shtei tfiris. If you do one more, you go up and then down, and then come back up again. That's called shalosh tfiris. So the Gemara has the kasha that if you do a Tofar shtei tfiris, the Mishnah says if you were Tofar shtei tfiris, you're chayiv. So the Gemara has the kasha v'haloi kaima. The Gemara asks, then what do you mean? If I was Tofar, what we call a stitch, it's really 2 stitches. But if I was Tofar a stitch, so it's not going to remain. And the Gemara seems to say that if it's not going to remain, that for sure is not going to be an issa deraisa. Maybe it'll be an issa derabbanan, but it's not going to be an issa deraisa. So Gemara says, "Who should kashvan?" No, we're making an ukimta that you tied it. Maybe you tied it on either end, and therefore it is going to remain. Now, the actual sugya of kosher and Mitzvah Hashem will learn, and the Rishonim ask a kasha over here that so why aren't you over on kosher? You should be also over on kosher. Some say maybe you are over on kosher. That's not our sugya. Our sugya is that somehow you made 2 tfiris. Once you made these 2 tfiris, so then now this is considered a Tofar that lasts. Why? Because we did something to make sure that it's going to remain. That's it. The Rambam, the Mishnah Berurah, and Sivkot and Chav Zayin, our siman for today usually is going to be Shin Mem, unless I tell you Shin Yud Zayin. But the Mishnah Berurah and siman Shin Mem and Sivkot and Chav Zayin, he brings down, it's not only 2 tfiras. It's also if you do 3 tfiras. And then you don't need to tie it because then it has more of a lastingness. If you do up, down, and then back again up, so then that's already considered that the 2 tfiras are going to remain. And that's already, even without a kosher. If you do 2 tfiras, the Mishnah Berurah says, and you don't tie it, says the Mishnah Berurah, you're going to be over in this Rabbanan. And this Rabbi say, not so many people are going to be sewing on Shabbos, and so it's not as negay over here, but just to make it a little bit practical, the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Mem in Siv Zayin discusses a case of where a person is mateach a chut, when the person goes, actually in Siv Vav, he pulls the thread. Let's say you have a button, and there's a thread that's coming loose, and you pull it, and it's already attached, but you pull it to tighten it. So Mishnah Berurah says that's a tolda of Tofir. The Shulchan Aruch says that's also called Tofir. Hamoteach chut shel tfira, the Shabbos is also chayav chatis. So this is the starting point of a Tofir. Just to give you a glimpse into the difficulty of Tofir, there's a tremendous shaila in the Paiskim, which I don't want to go into so much today. Maybe when we learn Refuah, we'll be ma'arich more about it. Maybe we were ma'arich already, actually, I should say. Let's say a person needs stitches on Shabbos. So is that Tofir? So the Tzitz Eliezer in Chelik Chaf and Siman Yud Ches, he says that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky on this shaila said there's no Tofir be'adam. We know there's certain malachas that apply to a person and certain that don't. But he said there's no Tofir be'adam. And the Goyim Shlomo Zalman in the Mincha Shleima, in Tinyana and Beis Gimel Siman Lamed Hey, also in Shmir Shabbos in Perek Lamed Hey, in Ha'ara Samech Vav, he brings down Tofir ba'adam is a chashash deraisa. That means if you have a situation where you have to have stitches on Shabbos, okay, if it's pikuach nefesh, it's a different story. But in a case where it's not a pikuach nefesh, so you have to use a guy because it's a shiloh of a deraisa. If it's a shiloh of drabanan, so then in a makim of stitches and chayli, we'd probably be making all day a Jew. But says Rosh Hashanah, he says, what do you mean? What's Tofir? You're doing a surah of Tofir. You're taking stitches and you're putting 2 things together. What's Tofir? It's taking 2 things and putting them together and making them one, like we've mentioned many times. So this is also a surah's Tofir. Now you can ask Rosh Hashanah, we know the truth. It's the Helik of Shefer which is doing everything. You're taking the 2 stitches, you're taking the 2 parts of skin, and you're just kivyachol making Hashem's job easier. You're holding it together, and then it's going to grow together on its own. So then why would that be a Tofir deraisa? So Rosh Hashanah Betzim addresses that Nakuda, and Rosh Hashanah says, no, because the malacha of Tofir is when you take a stitch and you do like the derech of the umnin, and you take it and you're enabling these 2 things to be one, which the eventuality of it is perhaps that now it'll grow together. But you're taking 2 things and holding them together and making a oneness out of those 2 things. So he says that's Tofir deraisa. Shlomo Zalman himself agrees that if you use a butterfly stitch, which is not a stitch, it's like a piece of very strong tape, we'll call it. So Shlomo Zalman says, no, that not. What's that? That's 2 parts of skin that you're just not letting separate from each other. So what's the difference? So this is a big insight that we started speaking about last week. When you're dealing with the Av Malach of Tofir, which is with stitches, which is taking a maisa with a third party and stitching it, and that's how you're putting it together. That's the doima to the mishkan. So then, a comment that you did a tzura of stitching, and it's done in the way of stitching, and it's holding 2 things together, and you want them to be held together until the point where it disintegrates on its own. So then that could be Tofir. Masha'in came when you're dealing with a butterfly. So now you're not in the Av Malacha of Tofir anymore. You're in the Tolda. The Tolda of Tofir we learned last time was when you take 2 things and you stick them together. But we saw that it has to be that you're sticking them together to create a oneness, because the malacha is doimit to the Av only mitzad that it has the aspect of the oneness, but it's not doimit in the tzura because you're not using thread. So now we saw last time that there's a lot of leeway. At Kam, that I'm not really making a oneness. What you're really doing is you're not making a oneness. You're not trying to make this skin and this skin into one all your day to tape. What you're trying to do is you're trying to take this piece of skin and this piece of skin. And we take this piece of skin and this piece of skin, You're trying to make it that they don't separate in order that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do his job easier. So then maybe that's not called a tolda of Tofar, says Rosh Shlomo Zalman. But this is another example of where the difficulty of tolda is. We could have the Tzitzel Eliezer telling you it's not a deraisa, and Rosh Shlomo Zalman telling you it's a deraisa because we don't have Gemaras. Embroidery. I'll ask the Olam. We know the difference between oirig and tofar. What's the difference between oirig and tofar? Oirig is when you are taking the shesi and the erev and you're making the beged. That's by taking the threads and you're looming it together and you're creating the beged. Tofar is totally different. Tofar is when you're taking the beged and you're sewing parts of the beged together. That's called tofar. So I asked the Olam, what's embroidery? Well, is embroidery tofar or is embroidery oirig? Meaning, is that in the weave? That's a part of the weave? Because the weave is here. And now you're adding something onto the weave. Or is that oirig? Because it's a part of the weave? Or is that tofar? Maybe tofar is only when I'm taking two things and putting them together. But when I attach this thing to the item itself, maybe that's not tofar. When you have a button and you attach it to a shirt, no, so that's tofar. Why is that tofar? Because it's two things that are being attached with a third party. But maybe when I'm attaching the thread itself to the beged, so then maybe that's not tofar, it's oirig. But you would think that such a thing, it would be pashit, right? It's far from pashit. The Teres Malachis, it's a sefer written in Eretz Yisrael by Rabbi Leitner. He brings in his sefer an oirig. He brings a machlekes between, I don't want to get in the middle of this, between two first cousins, between Chaim Kanievsky and Rav Nissen Karelitz. Chaim Kanievsky said it's oirig. When you embroider something, that's a part of the weave. And Rav Nissen Karelitz said that no, that's tofar. You're sewing something on, and the weave is already there. You're not making the weave, and that's tofar. I just use this to show the Olam how difficult it is to be magder and to have clarity in what's tofar. And now, Bez Hashem, we'll do what we can to try to make some sense. But already we learned nobody should be pulling the thread in order to tighten the button. Certainly shouldn't be pulling the thread out of the weave, because certainly that's something. Maybe it's patseya, the opposite of oirig, or maybe it's kareya, the opposite of tofar. But it certainly is something. So if you have a thread, don't pull it out. Sometimes it's even makeh b'patish, or sometimes it's even mechatech. It's making it straighter on the bottom, etc. This Rabbi Isai is the Akdama, and that's Hashem. Let's try now to get a little bit of a clarity in these inyanim. I would suppose that that let's give a little bit of a Akdamas over here to understand the melacha of tofar. We know already what we saw last time, that the Biur Halacha told us that the inyan of tofar is to make a oneness. Pashtis, ayidei thread, the Avmalach is to make a oneness ayidei thread. Pashtis, what the Biur Halacha is coming to explain, is something that will be marichan with Hashem when we learn kosher. When we learn kosher, which is he's coming lafuke. Why is tofar different than kosher? And on that, the Biur Halacha is explaining to us that kosher is not making two things into one, like we explained. Kosher is making two things held together. Tofar is when you take two things and you make a oneness. So it seems to be that one of the major prerequisites in the understanding of the melacha is the oneness. This is why you can understand why, and this is going to sound like a simple thing, but the nafkaminas can be very, very big. This is why, if I ask you, why is a button not tofar? Okay, maybe it's not kosher because we'll see in Mitzvah Shem when we learn kosher. In order to be kosher, perhaps you need some type of a movement of the item itself, intertangled within itself. A kosher has to have some type of a knot, some type of a chefts of a knot in order to have the shem kosher. Okay, say, but why is it not tofar? When I button an item, why is it not tofar? So you'll say, okay, because maybe it's tofar lizman. Tofar lizman, we know, Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Yud Zayin, in Sif Gimel, tofar lizman is a tremendous machlekes. We know in Ar Siman, Siman Shin Mem, Sif Zayin. We know in Ar Siman, Siman Shin Mem, Sif Zayin, that over there it talks about a person, they had some type of a shirt that at the end, like we have these buttons over here. In the Haim, they told us that's to make sure you don't wipe your nose on your sleeve. But the real reason was because in the Haim Amol, this part was opened up and it was closed. Sometimes it was closed al yedei buttons. Sometimes it was closed al yedei a thread, and then it would tighten the shirt. And the Shulchan Aruch discusses a case of where you have some type of a thread, you have some type of a thread in your shirt, and it was somehow sewn in, and you basically close it. You basically stitch it up, really, and you close it, and then your shirt stays closed. The two parts of your shirt are close to each other. And the Shulchan Aruch says you can't do this on Shabbos. Now, by side, it's clearly something he's going to open. He's got to get his hand out. So it's clearly something he's going to open. So maybe it's not the Raisa, but al kapanim we see it's Aser. What's the understanding? Because Tefirul Izman, there certainly are cases where we Aser, maybe the Rabbanon, maybe the Raisa. So what are you going to tell me? I'm closing a button on Shabbos. Why is it mutter? It's mutter because it's maybe Tofar, but it's Tofar Lizman. You're only doing it for a short term. First of all, I just showed you that Tefir Lizman is a very big shiloh, and it seems to be that Tefir Lizman is definitely a problem. The Rabbanon, the Raisa, but it seems to be it's definitely a problem. Mitzad Sheni also, well, and there aren't cases that we button things la'olam. Let's say you have, people have ruffles on the bottom. I forgot what they're called. I think they're ruffles on the bottom of the bed. I don't have these things. I don't have these things in Eretz Yisrael. But on the bottom of the bed that goes around the bed, you have these things that they button on. Or you can have a quilt. A good bacher, Abayisai, he takes his quilt, he puts it on, and he buttons it, and it stays buttoned for the end till the end of his man. I guess if he's a good bacher, he's not busy buttoning it. But you get my point. You could have situations of buttons which are not for short term. They're for very, 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 very long term. So what's the reason why you're allowed to? Elamai, you're going to tell me no. To button something la'olam is taka forbidden. Then one of the poskim should have mentioned this for Baisai. In Hilchos Shatnez, it discusses buttoning and discusses buttoning things for a long time. And it seems to say that there's no problem of buttoning things, and it's not Shatnez when you put together wool and you put together linen, even if it's al yedei button, unless the only way to separate them is by if the hole is sewn shut in a way where the button, it can't come out without ripping the hole. Excuse me, without ripping the hole. So shouldn't some of the poskim tell me that when you button something together, it's a problem? If you're going to button it la'olam, if you're a good husband and you're buttoning your quilt and your wife's quilt, right? So then you're buttoning it for more than a day, more than a week, sometimes a long time, etc. So since one of the points can say that it's only mutter to button for a short term and not for a long term. So the answer is obviously that there's a difference between buttoning and tofar. What's the difference? So you see from here, you see that the answer is very simple. Like the Mishnah Berurah told us in the Bir Halacha and Siman Shin Mem in the beginning of Yudalid, that the inyan of tofar is to make one. Buttoning, when you take something, is clearly not making it one. A button, the mahus of a button is something that when we look at a button, we see it's a tachlis of being able to put two things together and not remain as one, not become one. So that means that a button is fundamentally yesodistic different than the melacha of tofar. And therefore I can button something la'olam vayed. But let's go slow. So therefore, okay, now we know why a button is mutter. It's not making something into one, and I could even button something la'olam vayed. I go, don't make a mistake. Maybe you'll tell me. I'll tell you why a button is mutter, because a button is only a tkifa echas, right? We said that if you put it in just one time, like we know you have those tags on a suit, and they look like this, like we said last time. It has like these, and all you have to do is cut it there. That's mutter, because that was a tkifa echas. It's not a tofar. So button's the same thing. It's just taking one part of the shirt, the other part of the shirt, and putting it together with one stitch. So it's only a tkifa echas. Tkifa echas is mutter. The answer is that is true. And therefore, it certainly wouldn't be tofar. But the minchas chinuch has a suffix. Let's say I do tkifa echas, one stitch, not connected to each other, all the way down a shirt. Do we add them together? Minchas chinuch has a shaila about that. He says maybe that is a problem of tofar. No, so how are you going to button your shirt? Because it's tkifa echas, all the way down the shirt. So no matter what, we're going to have to answer this shaila, and we're going to see from here a tremendous insight. Tofar is making something one. A button is not making something one. So therefore you can button something la'olam vayed. Now, what I just said sounds very pashut and very primitive, and it is, but you'll see Rabbi say, it's going to get not so simple. Please wait one moment. And my wife is in here, and she would bring me a drink. But let me just, in my throat, it'll take me 1 second. Sorry, boys. I hope I gave all of you enough time also to make yourselves a tea. I hope I gave you all enough time to make yourselves a tea. So Rabbi saying, now we have to understand things that are a little bit more complicated, because a tofar, the extremes are simple. Tofar with stitches and making things one is aser. Buttons, I'm with the gomer, it's not making things one. Okay, let's see. Comes again the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Mem Siv Zayin, and he tells us another chiddush. Says the Shulchan Aruch that what happens if I have that case of my sleeve that we spoke about. I'm explaining now the Shulchan Aruch with the Mishabura. I have the case of the sleeve, and we said to, even if it's a stitch that you plan on not remaining, so that's a tofar lizman, and that's aser. Like I said, the Graz says it's only nisa d'Rabbanan, it's not nisa d'Oraisa, but nonetheless, it's aser. You have a stitching on your two parts of your sleeve, and you're putting them together. You clearly have to open it, Rabbi say, because there's no shaila that you can't get your arm out. To do that on Shabbos is aser. But said the Shulchan Aruch, let's say I have, like the way we have on shoes, I have stitches that go through my sleeve, like they have like sweatshirts like that. I have stitches that are going on my sleeve, but there's holes that are mesukin lekach. Like, imagine that there's like a metal hole and like a shoe, imagine a shoe, and it's going through, and it's clearly distinct that it's not a stitching which is going to remain. Says the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishabura, then that's mutter. Okay, so what's this all about? I'm doing a stitching. I'm doing the exact same thing. Here is a stitching, and it's the exact same part of the sleeve. But if it has holes that are mesuk in the kach, so then it says in Shulchan Aruch that I'm allowed on Shabbos to do this stitching and put it together, because it's clearly nicker that it's not going to remain. Okay. Then says the Mishnah Berurah, and with the Shulchan Aruch, however, let's say I tie it in a way, I stitch it through, and then I tie it at the top in a way where I can get my hand in and out. That's already not pashit, because now it can remain. If I do it to remain, that's for sure a problem. But even if I do it in a way where it could remain, even if I didn't plan on it remaining, that's a problem. So we're getting a lot here. We're getting, if you do a stitching, which is regular stitching, kanira, thank you, that's what it's called, an eyelet. Thank you. When you're doing a stitching which doesn't have an eyelet, I think I said it right. When you have a stitching that doesn't have an eyelet, so then that stitching is aser, even though it's borrowed that you're going to have to open it up because you can't get your hand out, because that has a tzura of stitching. We're getting somewhere here, Rabbi said. Watch. It has a tzura of stitching. It looks like the av malacha, and therefore it's aser. When I have something that looks like a shoe, so then even though I did a maisa of stitching, but it doesn't have the real tzura of stitching of a oneness, I guess this is like a button. Everyone looks at this and sees that it's not going to remain. However, if I do it to remain, or I do it in a way where it could technically remain, because I do it in a way where my hand could come in and out, I don't tie it tight. So then that goes back to, it does have some kind of an echadness, a oneness, and it's a oneness through a stitching. Now, by sight, let's put all of this together. Let's put all of this together and try to figure this out. What do I mean? What I mean is that, let's go one more shayla. There's one more case in this puzzle. In Shin Yud Zayin, we saw that if you have two shoes that are sewn together, so it says over there that type of a tofar it gets involved in the shayla of Tfir Lizman. Now, by when you have two shoes that are sewn together, isn't it the most obvious thing in the world that if you have two shoes that are sewn together, you're going to have to cut them apart? So why don't I say that when I have two shoes that are sewn together, so then that's not tofar. Just like when it came to the situation of those mesukin lekach, when you had those eyelets, so everybody knows it's not going to remain. So we know the answer already, and the Goyim of Moshe speaks this out in Chelik Beisim and Beidalad in that tshuva. The Moshe explains that it has to be nicker in the stitch, not in the circumstance. It's not enough that the circumstances are mechayiv me, that obviously I'm going to have to cut it apart. It has to be that the stitch itself shows that there's no oneness. So let's add up everything. A button is not tofar, because when you have a button, the stitch itself, we'll call it, is muchach, it's not a oneness. And not only that, the stitch itself is muchach, it's not a oneness, even if I do it lo'ilam vad, because it's a type of stitch, quote unquote, which you only use to not make a oneness. Okay, you go the other extreme, when you have real stitching, even if you're doing it not as a oneness, and it's clear it won't be a oneness, like in the case of shoes, which you're clearly going to have to cut apart, or like in the case of the sleeve where you can't get your arm out, that type of stitching is for sure aser. I said, Rabbanan, Deraisa. In the middle, we have a stitching that the stitching itself has a dimyan to the mishkan because you did stitching, but if you do it in a way where it's clearly not going to remain because you have it in, its surah is not going to remain, it's nicker in the stitching that it's not something that's meant to remain. It has an eyelet, it's clear that it's just meant to go, open and close like a button, then you can view it as a button. But that depends. If you actually tie it in a way where your hand can go in and out, so now since it has the dimyan, excuse me. Since it has the dimyan, mitzad the Maisa Tofar, so then that can turn into a tefira. In other words, thread depends. If it's regular threading, that's for sure like Tofar. If it's mesukin, then it depends. If you did a Maisa tefira plus it's something that can remain, so then we look at it not as a button. But Mashain Kain, if all you did was it's mesukin, it looks clearly like it's not something that's meant to remain, and you did it in a way where it won't remain, so then we view it as a button. This is very important to understand what we're going to speak about now. Comes along the Shevet HaLevi in Chelik Gimel. I think it was in Nun Aleph, and he's discussing our Shaila that we started with, which is the zipper lining. Shevet HaLevi was in Chelik Gimel Nun Aleph. Over there, he discusses the zipper lining. And he says, the most incredible chiddush, he says that if you take a zipper lining and you zip it in to the coat, he says, you're doing that for a long time, and that, he says, is going to be a problem of Tofar. He says, what's my makor that such a thing is going to be a problem of Tofar? And you should know, it's not just the Shevet Levi, it's also, excuse me, it's also the Chotshani in the 134th page, that he says this idea, Ruchsin ha-masukim b'mi'il chayrev k'dei l'chaber elav ha'bitna ve'ein b'daitoi loitzia. He plans on keeping it there the entire winter. He says it's aser mishum tofar. Now, the shaila is, what's the raya? Tofar, it's a zipper. Why is a zipper tofar? So, says the Shevet HaLevi, says the Chotshani, what do you mean? That's what we just learned in Siman Shin Mem. Siv Zayin. Hooray. You have something that mitzad echad, we know a zipper is something you can zipper up your pants, a zipper sweatshirt, and nobody's going to say that's aser. So what's this with the zipper lining that it's worth? So says the Shevet Levi, hayadvar me'olam. We have such things. You have a zipper lining that is something that its surah is of such that it depends. When you're leaving it la'ilam, doesn't that remind us of the case of the threading that was in a mesukin lekach tika matziv? And since it was mesukin lekach, we said it depends. If you're leaving it la'ilam, so then that's a problem. Then it becomes like tofar. Mashenkin, if you're not leaving it la'ilam, so then it'll be mutter. So he says, look, it's the exact same thing. Just like when it came to the sleeve that we spoke about, when it had the eyelets, and it's something that's going to remain. So then we say it looks like tofar. It's time to tofar. It's a problem. If it's clearly not going to remain, so then we look at its tzura. So he says, look, so who did a zipper? If it's a sweatshirt, it's clearly not going to remain. So then it's going to be mutter. Mashenkin, if it's something like a zipper lining, so then what's the difference between that and the case of Shin Mem when we had Mesuk in the kach that we said it's also the oilam? This is what the Shevet Levi says. But Rabbi say, if the Shevet Levi is right, so we have very big problems. Rabbi say, you come to open up your machzer on Rosh Hashanah, you come to Ma'ariv, or Shacharis the next morning, you're taking your machzer, you haven't used your machzer in a year, it has a zipper. Some of the old machzerim have zippers, even some of the new ones have zippers. So now, that's a zipper that was closed for a year. A year is for sure lo'olam when it comes to these inyanim. Let's say, comes Shabbos, all of a sudden you remember there's something in a suitcase, right, that you closed a long time ago, or you need a suitcase. It could happen on Shabbos. A person needs a suitcase. Okay, we have to dam mitzad in the chayil, but let's say you have a case, you have a sheitel head and a zipper, and it's been closed for 3 months, 4 months. So now, if this is true, that when you have a zipper that's closed for months, that's going to be considered a problem of tofar. So now you have to reevaluate everything. Okay, big deal, the zipper lining, or what happens in Yerushalayim? All of a sudden, this Shabbos, it's cold. Okay, so if it would be just a zipper lining, we'll tell the person, make sure you do it before Shabbos. But now we see there's many cases that this could be negaya. Now, Lemaisa, I must tell you that there is an Igros Moshe that you saw, and I'm not Chalila avoiding the Igros Moshe. The Igros Moshe is a chiddush. The Igros Moshe, most of what we're going to talk about doesn't start. The Igros Moshe is a chiddush. He's talking over there about diaper pins. And we're going to talk about that, safety pins. And the Igros Moshe says, a chiddush, that Taka the Aruch HaShulchan also says, they say the only time something is called tofar is when the opposite is called kareya. But Macha'en came, if in order to dismantle the tofar, you don't rip it, you just open it and take apart the 2 parts, but you don't rip it, so then it's not called kareya, it's not called tofar. Ramosha comes to explain over there that that's why safety pin says Ramosha is mutter to put a safety pin on 2 things, la'olam vod, and there's no problem. Because he says nobody rips apart. Tofar is the opposite malach of kareya, and the only time it has a shame tofar is when it was such a oneness that when you take it apart, it's called kareya. Says Ramosha, a safety pin is not called tofar because it's certainly not called ripping when you take apart a safety pin, when you open up the safety pin. So according to Ramosha, no shaila on the zippers either, because how could you call that tofar? According to Ramosha, there's no shaila that when I put together the zipper lining, it's not called I ripped it apart. So according to Ramosha, the story doesn't start. The only thing is, in a minute, we're going to see that Ramosha is against mamish kimat, all the poskim. Ramosha is coming to say a chiddush, which is against maybe the Mishnah Berurah, certainly Rebbe Kiva Eger, the Korban Hasanel, the Ginas Vradim, many achreinim, the Graz, the Ben Ish Chai. So I'm just going at this point now. Of course, Ramosha is bein b'shatz al-chak, bein shaloi b'shatz al-chak. It can be seimach on Ramosha, but the whole shir is based on if you're not going with Ramosha. And then obviously, if you find the kula, we can certainly be mitzaref for Ramosha, being there Ramosha you can rely on anyways. So the shaila is the lulei Rav Moshe. Is it mutter to put the zipper lining in? Now the truth is, Rabbi say, is that once you come to the understanding that no matter what on a button, we're clearly going to say a button is mutter la'olam. What we laid down is the anach and understanding in tofar, and we said that's borrowed that to button anything la'olam, even if you're buttoning the whole shirt. Which is a bunch of tkif echas, and we said to do that la'olam is going to be mutter, and nobody ever at a have a meaning that's aser. Or for sure the poskim would have had to have said it because they didn't have zippers or by side, but they certainly had buttons, and they certainly had situations where they buttoned things for a long time, and none of the poskim ever said that the button la'olam is going to be a problem. So what's the reason that buttoning something is not going to be a problem la'olam? So we explained because a button is a chayfetz that the tzura of it is that it's 2 things that you want to not be a oneness. By the fact that you're using the button, you're using something that has an escape clause. You're showing I don't want to oneness. You're showing I'm using something that I want to be holding it together. That's the uptight of a button. The reason why you don't sew your shirt and you button your shirt is fakir, because you want to be able to open and close it. You don't want it to remain one l'olam vod. And huadin on your blankets, when you have the quilt cover, the reason why you have a button and you don't have sewing is for carrot, because you want to be able. So even if you're going to do it for a long time, but it's mahus, it's something which screams not oneness. Rabbi say, if that's the case, and we asked, what's the difference between that and the case of the thread on your sleeve? The teretz is because mitzad the stitch, it doesn't scream. Mitzad the circumstance, it screams that it's not going to remain one. But a button is fundamentally different than a stitch. It is a chayfetz that it's the mechaber, it's the medium, it's the shadchin, which is showing I'm not a shadchin that's making a oneness. I'm a shadchin that's holding two things together. A stitch is a type of medium that holds two things together and makes them one. The fact that the circumstance is of such that it's obviously not going to do that, that we say, says the Goyim Rav Moshe and others, that we say is not necessarily going to take away the shem tofar. That's why when you sew two shoes together, it's a oneness. Because the stitch is not muchach, the circumstance is muchach. So once the stitch is not muchach, then it's within the parsha. When you have mesukin lekach, when you add eyelets, so there we said it depends. The circumstance is not just what's being machiach. The actual stitch is being machiach. Because look, you see it's done in this type of a thing, that's dumia to a button. Unless you decide to keep it forever. So then the etzem fact that it's a stitching plus the fact that it's going to remain forever, we give it a shame of a stitch, or that it could remain forever. I ask all of you, a zipper. In what is a zipper more doima to? Is it more doima to stitching or to a button? The answer is obvious. The answer, of course, it's doima to a button because it's not a stitch. The entire chiddush that we saw is only by a stitch. So when you want to know, is a zipper doima to mesukin lekach? Definitely not. A zipper is much more doima to a button. The machus of a zipper is it's a type of an item, it's a medium, which is being used b'dafka to not allow for a oneness. It's giving me an escape clause. Why over there by the case of the stitching of the mesukin lekach did we say it's asur l'olam? The answer is because that has the aleph base. It's a stitch. So when you're a stitch, it depends. If you're a stitch, which will remain l'olam, then you go into the parsha of tofar. If you're a stitch, which won't remain l'olam, and you have these mesukin lekach, then you go into the parsha of button. But that's the chiddush. The chiddush is not why is a zipper a button. The chiddush is the other way. Why in the world is something that's a stitching we're going to allow to be a button? So that I explained to you. That a comma, it's clear that it's not going to last l'olam, and it's mesukin lekach, it's not like a regular stitching, then we put it into the parsha of a button. But if I say any medium which has a self-destruct button is clearly going to go into the parsha of buttons. That's why Velcros won't be a problem. That's why buttons aren't a problem, all l'olam. That's why all these things will not be a problem l'olam. And that l'chayr is why on Shabbos it would be mutter on Shabbos to put the zipper lining in l'olam. I must tell you that this is the pashtus. This is definitely the pashtus. Who actually says this in print? They don't explain, maybe perhaps. The whole sugya. But the Rebbeinu in Shtayb, in Siman Tetzvav, in the Bamaschal, Vim Kain says this. The Betel Chachma, in Chel Gimel, Siman Tzadiches, Vaisches says this idea. And the Goyim Rishleim is Alman. In Shmir Shabbos, Perak Tezvav, Reish Mem Vav says this, that a zipper lining is mutter and it's not tofar. The answer is why? Because it's a button. Even the Zman Meruba, it's like a button. Now, the only thing I will tell you is there's a chiddush from the Emes L'Yankiv, Rabbi Yankiv Kamenetsky. He says that you're not allowed to put in the zipper lining for a different reason, nothing to do with tofar. He says it's a problem of mesakin moneh. This is l'chayra a little bit of a pella, because we spoke, when it comes to Mesakin Mana, we said once that anything that's the first time, or the Shidduch is the first time, that's Mesakin Mana. But something that it's not the first time, and if this lining was in already once, so if the lining was never in, okay, then I hear maybe it's Mesakin Mana. But if the lining was once in and you're just reassembling, we said that won't be Makeh Patish, and therefore, if somebody's in a bind, he's stuck, and he wants to open up a zipper on Shabbos, and I don't mean just from his hoizen, I mean from his, from the suitcase, or he has a wedding dress that's been closed for a long time and he wants to get nostalgic. His wife wants to see the wedding dress, or he has a zipper lining that he needs to put in. It's not the first time. So then the pashtus is, it's like a button and it's not considered tofar. This Rabbi Isai is the Akadama to understand one of the very, very geschmackish sugyas in Hilchos Shabbos, which is the sugya of the pins, of the safety pins. And with this Akadama Rabbi Isai, it's going to be Bez Hashem, smooth sailings. The Kolben Nistanil in Shabbos Perek Zayin Nun. He says, Tomani, I have a big pella. What's the pshat in the minig oilam that they used to use? They used straight pins in those days, but they had a pin that's called a staknudel, a kreuz, right? And they would take this pin, like a brooch, and they would put together two parts. Hamal b'shikorin shuftza. In other words, if you take a safety pin and you take this part, and you put only one through this shirt and one through the needle through the other side, and you attach it at the top, that's called a tkifa echas, and that's no problem at all. But he's talking about that you went in and out, you went up and down, and then you close the safety pin. He says, hello, that's shtei tkifas, and it's kashran. Kashran means it's closed. Kashran's not exeris akasiv that you have to tie it at the end. It's you have two tkifas that are going to last. So he says it's shtei tkifas. And anashim b'Prague, the ladies of Prague, the Helik of Vaiba in Prague, shemechaber mashleyer and amachatim havish shtei tkifas. This is the great shaila of Rabbeinu Agadol the Korban Esano, no less than the Ginas Vradim in Klal Gimel Simin Yud Zayin Simin Yud Tes. The Korban Esano was very edel, says the Chsein Ish in the Shmatas in Simin Kufnun Vav. A letter that he wrote to Rabbi Yamin Zilber, my understanding is, he was very edel, says the Korban Esano, says the Chazon Ish, when he asked the question. He wasn't really saying a psak, says the Chazon Ish. He was just being matama on the minig, says the Chazon Ish. He realized he was from Prague and there were great gedolim and tzaddikim that lived them and nobody objected. Koinim, adirim. And in those days, he writes, everybody was Yerushalayim, Hayirachet. So he was just matama, he didn't understand it. But the Chazon Ish says that the Korban Esano was just asking a question, but I must tell you, Rabbi Isai, the Ginas Vradim in Klal Gimel, and Simin Yud Zayin, Simin Yud Tes, he doesn't ask any shilas. He says, borrow that to put this straight needle in, if you do it 2 times, and it's not going to last. But if you do it 3 times, so then it's going to last. And he says you should be chayiv. And the shoyel of the Ginas Vradim said, well, maybe it's a metal thread, so maybe it's shalei kederech. He says, who are you to decide what's a shalei kederech? Don't you know that the Gemara in Shabbos says that when you take a clod of dirt and you throw it at a tree, and the fruit falls out, the tamer falls out, that's called dash. He says, is that normal? Why isn't that shalei kederech? So do you know what's called shalei kederech? That's how the Ginas Vradim says. Rabbi Isai in this week's parsha, the Meyam Layez, that's written for the Pshutayam, for everybody, in Parshas Yisrael, in page 619, the Meyam Layez brings that ladies cannot usher they take some type of a pin and they attach together some type of a scarf under their arm, and they forget it on their Shabbos, and they do it on Shabbos. Asalasis came. You're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed. And he says, Gamze Avain. It's a very big Aveira. He says, are you going to tell me that they're definitely not doing it to last? But Rabbi Isai, we learned that Tefirah Lizman is also a problem of Tefirah. We learned that Betz and Ramah brings down that Tefirah Lizman is a problem. So they're doing Tefirah Lizman. This is brought by Rebbe Kiva Eger. Rebbe, Simin Shin Mem on the Magen of Ram Sivkat Yudal, and he obviously learned not like the Chazon Ish in the Korban Esano, because he brings the Korban Esano and he says it as a psak. He says the Korban Esano says that b'toifer based tefirus it's an issa d'Rabbanan, and therefore he says he means it's an issa d'Rabbanan because it's not connected. But if we are going to have safety pins where it's connected, it would be an issa d'Oraisa. He says it's an issa l'chaber the malbushim. You can't put them together, and kain because of the Ginas Vradim. So Rabbi Kiva learns the Korban Esano was saying a psak. You can't use a pin on Shabbos, even though it's for short term, but it's toifer lizman and that's aser. That's the Ginas Vradim, that's the Korban Esano, that's the Imam Loyes, it's Rabbi Kiva Eger, and the Graz, the Balatanya. in the Kuntres Achron, in Madur Basra, in Saif Siman Shin Aleph. The Baal HaTanya says it's Aser. And no less than our Rebbe, the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah Siman Shin Mem Siv Katan Chav Zayin says those people that they take the krois, the brooch, and they attach it to the baguette, and it's shtei tkifes, lav shaper avdi. It's not a good thing what they're doing. Interesting. Why doesn't the Mishnah Berurah say Aser? Interesting. And then also the Mishnah Berurah says, where's the makor? That's korban asana. It's a very interesting klal from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. Mishnah Berurah has a sefer called Mishnah Berurah, and it's a sefer called the Sharet Tzion. In the Sharet Tzion, he brings down all the makoros of the sefer in the Mishnah Berurah. That's the job of the Sharet Tzion. Sometimes you find a very interesting thing. Sometimes upstairs in the Mishnah Berurah, he says a psak, and then he brings in brackets, Mogen Avram. Okay, why didn't he bring it in the Sharet Tzion? The makor of everything is the Sharet Tzion. So Rabbi Yankov said a klal, which is a very, very oiskalten klal in the Welt. Rabbi Yankov said that when the Mishnah Berurah says, this is my sefer, you want to know the makor, go downstairs in the Sharet Tzion. Sometimes the Mishnah Berurah sees something from a chashav achron, that he doesn't know if it's 100%, he has a shaila about it, something, but he wants you to know that this achron said this. He just doesn't want it in his sefer. So then he'll write, those people that take a krois, a safety, a pin, and attach two parts together, they're not doing something beseder. And says the Mishnah Berurah, korban esanel in brackets, upstairs, not in the Sharet Tzion. Now what's that? Says Rabbi Yankov, because it wasn't clear to the Mishnah Berurah. The Rabbi Yankov said his klal on this Mishnah Berurah. This was his example of that klal. And I'll ask you to show them the Mishnah Berurah. Thank you. What does the Mishnah Berurah say? He says they're not doing beseder, and then what? Korban esanel brackets. Rabbi said, go downstairs. Mishnah Berurah has a sefer called the Sharet Tzion. Why isn't he right over there? Sharet Tzion, Sivkotin, Samech Gimel, or whatever. Korban esanel. The Teretz says because it's not in his sefer. He doesn't want it in the Mishnah Berurah. He obviously wants you to know it, so he's bringing you this chashav achron, so you should know it. And that's a little bit of a Pesach. To try to maybe look for a bit of a limit chos that the Welt does use. The Welt does use safety pins. Now, you know already the secret, the Igros Moshe in Chelik Beis and Siman Pei Daled. Lehedja is chaylik on this Mishnah Berurah. Lehedja chaylik on this korban esanel. He brings down that there's nothing to discuss because the yesod of Tofar, he has two malachim there. We'll go with the ikar malach of Ramosha, is that the yesod of Tofar is it's only called Tofar if taking it apart is called kareya. But he says taking a safety pin apart is not called kareya. So therefore, this isn't kareya, and therefore you can put a safety pin on. Says Ramosha lo'ilam vad. He says maybe there's a makam to be machmir for lo'ilam, for long term, but certainly not for short term. That's Rav Moshe. But Rabbi Say, you do have to realize that all of the achrayim we just mentioned are for sure not going with that yesod. Korban esanel, Ginas Vadim, Yamloyes, Rabbi Kiv Eger, the Baal HaTanya, all of them, the fact that they're answering a safety pin or a straight needle are clearly going the loike Igros Moshe. As I say, we still have to try and figure out a limit chos for the Welt that uses safety pins. If you want to go with the mahalech, the loike Igros Moshe. That the opposite, that enechanami, Tofar is called when I'm putting two things together. But lav dafka, is it called Tofar when it's such a togetherness that it's called a ripping in order to take it apart. That, you see all these achrayim held, it could still be called Tofar. Now, the Chazon Ish, in Siman Kufnan Vav, in the Ashmatis, in Siman Shin Mem, he goes very, very strong that the Korban Esanel admits that this was the Miniga Oilam and that people did use safety pins, or at least pins. They didn't have safety pins maybe in those days. And he says there were Gedolei Oilam that saw these Minagim and they had Yershamayim, and therefore you could be Saimech that they were using safety pins. And that's mitzad, the Etzim idea that he doesn't believe that you should be Machmir mitzad this Korban Esanel. But he goes on and he asks a question, which really, that's the major shaila that you have to ask over here in Lumdis. Because the Ginas Vadim tells us, okay, Mali, a metal thread Mali, a regular thread, and therefore this could be Tofar. And Mali, Lizman, Derech Agav, it's interesting. The Tzitz Eliezer, others, they bring down that Rabbi Kiva Eger was by a bris, or many brisim for that matter, and Rabbi Kiva Eger wouldn't open up the diaper on Shabbos. Now the diaper was definitely just a tefillah Lizman. So they bring down that you see Rabbi Kiva Eger wouldn't open up the diaper if it had the safety pin, if it had the pin in it, because he was makbid on this. See how much Rabbi Kiva Eger was makbid on this. So the Tzitz Eliezer wants to say, no, the opposite, but you see, let somebody else open it. But everybody say that's not the biggest raya. Why not? Because everybody knows that there was some minig of Tfir Lizman that the people were makel on Tfir Lizman. So maybe Rabbi Kiva Eger held it's Tfir Lizman, I don't have to be meicha. But mitzad the actual idea of a safety pin being Tfira, you see, he did hold it was Tfira. For example, the Chazon Ish asks on the Korban Nesanel, he says, why weren't the Rabbanim, if the Korban Nesanel is right, then why weren't they meicha? That's not a kasha. I'll tell you why they weren't meicha. Because people were only doing Tfir Lizman. And I mentioned many times in the shir that Tfir Lizman to Shaila, that many poskim agreed that the minig oilam is to be make on Tfir Lizman. But you have not proven to us that a safety pin is not considered a tefira. You just proved to us that the minig oilam was to be make on Tfir Lizman. But maybe taka, it's definitely called a tefira. But the Rabbi said the ikar question of the Chazon Ish is really an earth-shattering shaila. The Chazon Ish says, I don't understand. Says the Chazon Ish, what's the difference between a safety pin and the case of the thread that was mesukin lekach? Rabbi Isai, we learned that when you have even threading, even stitching, if in the stitching it screams that it's not going to remain, what stitching screamed it's not going to remain? Remember, shoes that were stitched together is not muchach mitzad the stitching. It's muchach mitzad the circumstance. So that we said the problem. But when we had the eyelets and it was something that was open, and it was something that was tight, and you're going to clearly have to open it, we said that stitching screams, I'm like a button. Frag the Chazon Ish, ein asui lekiyem, ein derech tfira, v'zeh mevur, simin shim mem, ha'chaylik bedini dik batei yadayim, v'kasav kevin she'ein ha'edik el lefi shah, and this is the minig la'akol, and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring any oisrim. So he says, look, a safety pin is something that screams, I'm Lizman. A safety pin is something that screams, I'm Lizman. So if about it screams, I'm Lizman, so then we found a stitching. Remember we said, Rabbi Isai, if you're a button in a zipper, you're always screaming, I'm Lizman, and I'm not making one. When you're stitching, it depends. If outside circumstances scream that you're not a oneness, that's not enough for us. But within the stitch, if it's screaming that I'm not a oneness, so then that was enough for us to say that it's a button. A safety pin is something that it's a metal type of a thread with a safety pin to come in and out. Doesn't that scream that I'm not going to remain? Because if you would want to remain, you would use a thread, a regular thread, not a metal thread. That's the bamba kacha the Chazon Ish. And by saying, what did all these other achrayim hold? They obviously held that a metal thread is a thread nonetheless. And taka, there are situations, and even the Chazon Ish will agree. If you take a thread, and if you look good in this Chazon Ish, you'll see, even the Chazon Ish will agree. Let's say I have my cuff on my pants is falling down. It came out. And you could take one of those mini tiny little safety pins and you could stitch it in a way that no one will see. And Rabbi say that can remain l'olam vad, and there are people that do that and they leave it l'olam vad. And God, I brought the wrong tie today, but I have a tie that has a safety pin that holds. I should have worn my other tie. That the flap in the back is held together by a safety pin, and it's been there for years and months. And nobody cares. Says even the Chazon Ish would agree that if you have a metal stitch could be normal, not like the Guinness Brodim. I'm sorry, like the Guinness Brodim, that a metal stitch could be normal, not like the Shoyal the Guinness Brodim, and it's a stitch that could remain, and therefore a metal stitch could remain. So maybe these other Achronim held, metal stitches are not something that mitzad the chefsa of the stitch screams that I'm not lo'olam. It's also mitzad the circumstance. So if you have a metal stitch taka, let's break it down. If you have a metal stitch that you put in, a safety pin that you put in a way where it's going to remain la'olam. It's not going to bother anyone. It's on the inside of a jacket. It's on the bottom of a hem. And it's something that it could remain and you plan on it remaining. Then Ramesh is going to say it's mutter, of course. The Chazon Ish is going to agree that that's aser. And that's because a metal stitch is a stitch. And its surah is of such that it can remain one. And we don't see that it's a self-destruct button. You're going to ask, what do you mean? But it's a safety pin and it has an escape clause, etc. But we said when it's stitching, it's not enough. Just like by mesukin lekach, by an eyelet, it wasn't enough that it's a stitching that's mesukin lekach. It had to be a stitching, which number one is mesukin lekach, and number two, something that is not remaining. But let's say I do, like we said, the case of the eyelets, and I plan on it remaining. So we said that's aser. Or even if it's something that could remain, we said that's aser. So now a metal stitch is a stitch. So if I have a metal stitch in a place where I could remain, or I plan on it remaining, then that's for sure a problem. The machlokes, the Chazon Ish, and we'll call it the korban asano, is one prat. Let's say I have a stitch, a metal stitch, and it's in a place where it's clearly not going to remain, like on a diaper, etc. So now the other Achronim said it's not muchach in the stitch it's going to remain. So it's a metal stitch, which is not muchach in the stitch that it's going to remain. It's muchach in the circumstance that it's going to remain. Because you see that this metal stitch in other places could technically remain. And the Chazon Ish said not like that. He said, why are you using a metal stitch? A metal stitch is something that's considered mesukin lekach. But it's a pratistic machlokes. Basically, Rabbi Isai, if you want to know at the end of the day, can I use a safety pin on Shabbos? The answer is according to Rav Moshe, always. If you want to know, is there malkum to be machmer lo'ilam? Rav Moshe says, it's a malkum to be machmer, but maker, then it's mutter. The other extreme, if you have a safety pin that you're using, well, say it like this. Rav Moshe says it's always mutter, maker, then. If you take a safety pin and you do it in a way where it can remain lo'ilam void, and people actually do remain lo'ilam void, or you plan on making it remain lo'ilam void, and it's maybe sometimes the small ones, and it's holding up a hem, or it's holding up a this, that you have to know that most poskim are machmir on that. That most poskim say it's a metal thread, and you're not going to say it's mesukin lekach, because it's something that is a stitching. And on stitching, we don't automatically put it onto the team of buttons. The only time we take a stitching and put it onto the team of buttons is when, number one, it's mesukin lekach, and number two, it's muchach, that it's not going to be remaining lo'ilam. So, if you actually take a metal stitch and you put it into a way of where it could remain lo'ilam, like my cases of the hems and the cuffs, etc., so that many poskim are machmer on. The other case, that it's something that's clearly going to be opened, and you plan on opening it, it's clear from the tzura you're going to open it, like a diaper, these types of things. So, and of course, it has to be, we're only talking where it's 2 stitches, obviously, that's what we said. But al kapanim, if it's something that clearly is going to be opened, not something that's hidden away in a cuff, it's something that, it's clearly, it's on the outside, you see it, you can't get in without opening the diaper. So then you have to know that the korban asano, the Ginas Vradim, Rabbi Kveger, they were machmir, and clearly the minig oilam is to be makel, and on that you can for sure be saying on Rav Moshe anyways. Right? But the other case, that there would be a makom to be machmir. So what did we learn today, Rabbi Isai? We learned we only have 2 lines in the Gemara, 1 line of Gemara, 2 Shulchan Aruchs, but we learned a very, very geschmackas sugya. We learned the button, you can button la'olam. What's on the team of a button? Stama zipper lining, zippers you could open whether they were closed la'olam or not. Velcro, la'olam, these things are things that are clear, they're safe, they're a self-destruct button. And is a safety pin included in that? That's a very big shaila. Is a safety pin included in that? If it's done la'olam, there's a very big svara to say a safety pin is absolutely not included in that. And that a safety pin is something which it's a metal thread, and therefore if it's done la'olam, you certainly have to be machmer on that. That's a very big shaila. If it's not la'olam, then there's a ganz fine makom to be makel. And anyways, Rav Moshe was makel on all of the svaras that we spoke out today. So Rabbi Isai, I hope now, Tofer, I hope we sewed it all together and we put it all together. Bezos Hashem. And it's Hashem. We'll get together again next week. Bezos Hashem Mispara.